"So when do you dump her?" the mistress asked the billionaire CEO, not knowing his wife actually owns the company. She came home early. That was the only mistake she made. The only one. And it was not even a mistake. It was just Tuesday, a flight that landed ahead of schedule. A car that moved faster than expected through the city. A woman who thought for once she would come through the door without an agenda, without a call to return, without a meeting to prepare for, just come home. Just walk into the life she had built and breathe it in for a moment before the world started asking things of her again. She was 3 steps from his office door when she heard the voice. It came through the gap like smoke, soft, careless, the kind of voice that had never been told it was asking too much. "So when do you dump her?" Naomi Osei stopped walking. Her coat was still on, her bag was still on her shoulder. One hand was halfway to the door handle, and it stayed there, suspended in the air, perfectly still. Adrian laughed. Not the laugh she knew. Not the polite, measured laugh he deployed at dinners when clients said something mildly amusing. This was different. This was warm, open. The laugh of a man who felt completely, absolutely safe. "Timing matters, Irina," he said, and his voice carried that easy confidence she had once found irresistible, back when she had believed that confidence was something he shared with her. "You do not walk away from something this established without a clean exit strategy. But you are walking away." The woman's voice, Irina, had an edge beneath the softness. Playful on the surface, pointed underneath. "I am not interested in being the forever secret, Adrian." "You will not be." His chair creaked. He was leaning back. Naomi knew that sound, the way you know the sounds of the house you have lived in longest. He always leaned back when he felt in control of a conversation. Naomi will process it the way she processes everything. Cleanly. She is too focused on her work to make anything complicated. There was a pause, and then Irina laughed, and it was a pretty laugh, the kind that probably made men feel clever just for being near it. "Poor thing," Irina said. "She sounds exhausting." "She is extraordinary at what she does," Adrian said. And Naomi waited. She stood perfectly still in the corridor of her own building. The building she had purchased at 31 with the first real profit her company ever turned, and she waited for the sentence that would follow. The one that placed her in the story with weight, with presence, with the acknowledgement that 9 years had meant something. But the extraordinary at what she does was the whole sentence. After that, he moved on, talked about the deal, the timeline. 6 weeks, maybe less, he said. The financial restructuring is already in motion. By the time it becomes visible, it will already be finished. Naomi's hand came down from the door handle. She stepped back, not away, just into the shadow near the corridor corner where the light from his office would not reach her. Her breathing stayed even, controlled. She had learned that control over years of boardrooms and negotiations and rooms full of people who looked at her and decided in the first 3 seconds that she was not the most important person present. She had always let them believe that. It was easier to work from a position people underestimated. She listened for 4 more minutes, cataloged everything. The timeline, the asset restructuring he had already begun. His certainty that she would not look, would not notice, would not think to check the things that still carried her name, because she had been the one with the credit score, and the relationships, and the operational knowledge, when his firm was still a vision in a spare bedroom. His certainty that patience looked like powerlessness. She had heard enough. She walked back down the corridor, silent, precise. She opened the front door and closed it again, louder this time, the sound of someone arriving. "Adrian," she called, and her voice sounded exactly as it always did. Steady, warm, unhurried. His office door opened within seconds. He appeared holding his phone face down against his thigh, and the smile he gave her was the smile of a man looking at something familiar. Not precious, familiar. "You are home early," he said. The summit wrapped ahead of schedule. Naomi set her bag on the entryway table and looked at him the way she had looked at him 1,000 times. She was looking at something completely different now, but nothing in her face showed that. "How has your week been?" "Busy. The Vantage acquisition is getting complicated." He was already half turning back toward his office. "I have a few more calls to get through tonight." "Of course." she smiled. "I will get dinner sorted." She did not get dinner sorted. She went upstairs to her private office, the one on the third floor she had designed herself when she converted the building's upper level into a workspace, and she opened her laptop and she began. Not a plan for revenge. She was precise about that in her own mind, even then, even in those first quiet hours of understanding what she was actually dealing with. She did not think of it as revenge. She thought of it the way she thought about every failing organization she had ever been brought in to evaluate. A reality assessment. What is actually here? What is actually mine? What happens when the assumptions holding this structure together are finally tested? First, she went to the financial accounts. She had set most of them up herself in the early years, when Adrian's consulting firm was promising but not yet stable, when her name on the documents had been the difference between approval and rejection at every institution that mattered. She still had full access. He had never removed her, had never thought he needed to, because Naomi was focused on work, because Naomi processed things cleanly, because Naomi would not look. She pulled 7 years of records in under 40 minutes. Then she went to the Vantage file. This was where it became something else entirely. Naomi knew the Vantage deal, had listened to Adrian talk about it across 100 dinner tables, had heard the excitement in his voice when he described the acquisition that was finally going to establish his firm as a serious player in the infrastructure space. She had asked occasional questions, offered no opinions he had not solicited, listened. What Adrian did not know, what he had no way of knowing because he had not thought to ask, was that Vantage Industries operated in a sector Naomi had been quietly studying for 2 years. Infrastructure logistics, the same space her own company, Osei Group, had been positioning to enter. She had a research file on Vantage that her team had prepared 6 months ago, sitting in an encrypted drive marked Quarterly Strategic Review, comprehensive and meticulous, and never once mentioned at dinner. She opened both files side by side and began reading. By midnight, she understood the full architecture of what Adrian was building, and she could see, with the clarity of someone who had spent 15 years understanding how organizations actually functioned beneath their surfaces, exactly where the foundations were not his to stand on. The acquisition depended on 3 things to close successfully. A licensing agreement with a company called Carrick Systems, whose proprietary software was integral to Vantage's entire operational model, financing from 2 institutional investors, whose commitment was contingent on specific performance guarantees through the first year post-acquisition, and the continued cooperation of Vantage's senior operations team, 3 individuals who had been quietly fielding other offers since the acquisition was announced and had not yet made their decisions. Naomi sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She knew the CEO of Carrick Systems, had known her for 6 years. They had served together on an industry advisory board, had made a habit of dinner when their cities aligned, had built the kind of professional friendship grounded in genuine respect rather than strategy. Naomi knew, because she paid attention to things Adrian cataloged as background noise, that Carrick's leadership had serious reservations about the Vantage acquisition, had expressed them informally to several mutual contacts, worried that the acquiring firm lacked operational sophistication, worried about what an underprepared transition would cost a licensing partner in real terms. Naomi closed her laptop at 1 in the morning, went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to Adrian's voice murmuring through the floor below as he finished what she now understood were not client calls. She did not reach for his side of the bed, did not feel the absence of warmth the way she might have a year ago, a month ago, even a week ago. Something had reorganized itself inside her chest in that hallway, and what it had reorganized into was not cold and not angry. It was simply clear. She knew what she was going to do. She was going to be patient for a little while longer, and then she was going to stop. If you have ever watched someone build on a foundation you laid, watched them take credit for the architecture while you maintain the structure from underneath, you already know what Naomi felt in those first quiet days after the hallway. You know the particular quality of that silence, the way you move through familiar spaces and look at things you thought you understood and realize you were looking at them slightly wrong the entire time. Stay with this story, because what Naomi does next, the precision of it, the patience of it, the absolute refusal to be dramatic when strategic was available, is something I need you to see all the way through. The next morning, Adrian left early for a client breakfast. Naomi was at her desk by 6. She sent a message to the CEO of Carrick Systems. Not about the deal, not about Adrian, just a warm note saying she was back from Singapore and would love to catch up when schedules allowed. Genuine, unhurried, the kind of message that came from a real friendship. The response arrived within 40 minutes. So glad you are back. I actually have something I would love your perspective on, acquisition related. Are you available for lunch this week? Thursday, Naomi replied. My treat. She closed her messages and returned to the Vantage file. She had 300 pages left to read. The days that followed existed in 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, nothing had changed. Naomi went to work, came home, moved through the routines of the marriage with the same composure she had always maintained. She made dinner 3 times that week, asked Adrian about his calls, listened to him vent about deal friction with the kind of calm attention he had always interpreted as wifely steadiness. She had always been steady. He had just never understood what steadiness was capable of when it finally decided to move in a direction of its own choosing. Underneath the surface, she was building something he could not see. She needed to understand the Vantage deal not just from Adrian's perspective, but from every angle simultaneously. She read Carrick Systems, public filings, their industry positioning, their financial statements for the past 3 years. She identified what they needed from the Vantage licensing relationship, and, more importantly, what would make them walk away from it. She researched the institutional investors, their risk profiles, their history with acquisitions that encountered operational difficulties in the first year. She found the LinkedIn profiles of Vantage's 3 senior operations staff and spent an afternoon understanding their professional histories and what they would need to feel secure in a transition. She did all of this from her private office, while Adrian worked 2 floors below. They shared meals. They discussed the weather and the news and the minor logistics of a shared life. He texted her twice that week from what she now knew were Irina's planned restaurant recommendations, and each time she responded warmly and said it sounded lovely. On Thursday, she had lunch with the CEO of Carrick Systems. It lasted 3 hours. Her colleague laid out her company's concerns without prompting, the operational immaturity of the acquiring firm, the absence of any visible integration planning, the growing sense among Carrick's leadership that Vantage was being purchased by someone who understood the asset's value without understanding the work required to realize it. She wanted Naomi's perspective on how to protect Carrick's position without blowing up a relationship that still had theoretical potential. Naomi listened to all of it, set down her fork when necessary to give the conversation her full attention, asked precise, considered questions, and when the moment was right, she gave her honest professional counsel. Know your leverage completely before you negotiate, she said. Document every operational concern you have now, while you still have time to make them conditions rather than grievances. And be genuinely willing to walk away if the acquiring firm cannot demonstrate the operational competence their acquisition depends on. Do not stay in a relationship that costs you more than it returns because you invested in the idea of it. Her colleague looked at her across the table for a moment before responding. You are talking about more than the deal, she said. Naomi smiled. I am talking entirely about the deal. They finished lunch. They talked about other things. They embraced in the street outside the restaurant and promised to do this more often. And 2 days later, when her colleague called to say that Carrick was formally requesting additional operational guarantees before confirming the licensing agreement, Naomi received that call professionally, expressed appropriate understanding, and took careful notes. She was also, by that point, in conversation with a contact at a boutique advisory firm who happened to have a relationship with one of Vantage's senior operations directors. The introduction was natural, mutual interest-driven, completely above board. Naomi was not telling anyone what to do. She was helping people understand their own positions clearly enough to make informed decisions. The decisions they made were their own. What Naomi was doing, and she was precise about this in her own mind because precision had always been how she protected her integrity even when the world around her operated without it, was simply removing her protection from a structure that had been built on the assumption she would always be there to hold it quietly together. She was not sabotaging anything. She was stepping back. And when you remove the invisible infrastructure from a building that was never designed to stand without it, the building reveals its own limitations. Adrian began to show the stress at home that second week. He came to dinner distracted, checked his phone between sentences, answered her questions with the abbreviated half-attention of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. He was not unkind to her. He was never actively unkind, which had always been part of the problem. He simply moved through their shared space as if she were furniture, present, assumed, not requiring engagement. She absorbed all of it without reaction. Continued to exist in the background of his crisis the way she had existed in the background of his success. On a Wednesday evening, he sat down at the dinner table and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "I do not understand why Carrick is being so difficult. The licensing terms are favorable. They should want to confirm." Naomi passed him the bread. "Operations relationships are complicated around transition," she said. "They are probably nervous about who they are tying themselves to long term. They will want to feel seen before they commit." Adrian waved it off. "The deal is structurally sound. The legal team will manage it." Naomi nodded and said nothing further. She had learned over years of doing work that other people described as just execution, that the most expensive thing a leader could do was dismiss the complexity of the thing they did not personally understand. She had tried to teach Adrian that, had explained it across 100 different contexts in the early years when she had believed he was genuinely listening, had watched him nod and move on and repeat the same dismissals in different rooms to different people. You cannot teach someone to value what they have decided is beneath them. You can only wait for reality to explain it in a language they cannot dismiss. The charity gala was 3 weeks after the hallway, an annual event, one of the major fixtures in the city's business community. Adrian insisted they attend together. Important clients would be there, potential investors, people who mattered. He told her what to wear, not as a conversation, as a statement. A specific dress, black and understated, elegant enough not to embarrass him, quiet enough not to draw attention away from where he wanted attention directed. Naomi wore the dress, did her hair the way he preferred, smiled in the car on the way over. She had worn this particular kind of invisibility for years, was practiced at it, knew its textures and its requirements, and the specific way you had to hold your face to make it look like presence when it was actually disappearance. But she was watching it differently now, cataloging it, letting herself see clearly what she had spent years accommodating without naming. The first person who spoke past her, rather than to her, was a business associate of Adrian's, someone Naomi had met at least a dozen times over the years. He directed every comment to Adrian, even when Naomi was the one standing in the center of the conversation. Talked about the Vantage deal, about market positioning, about the courage it took to pursue a vision of this scale. At the end of the exchange, he turned to Naomi and said, "You must be so proud," as if her only function in the room was to reflect Adrian's accomplishments back to him. She smiled and said she was. The second was worse. A woman Naomi's age, sharply dressed, the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped needing to perform. She worked in venture capital, had a reputation for asking the questions other people avoided. She looked at Naomi in the brief social assessment that took 3 seconds and communicated everything. And then she turned her full attention to Adrian. "I have been following your work," she said. "The Vantage acquisition is ambitious. Are you handling the operational integration in-house?" "I have people for that," Adrian said. "Operations are not the complex part. The real challenge is the vision, seeing the opportunity in the first place. Anyone can execute once the strategy is clear." The venture capitalist raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. "Operations can make or break an acquisition at this scale." "I am surprised you are not bringing in specialists." Adrian gestured vaguely at Naomi. "My wife actually works in operations. She does good work in her field." "My wife, not Naomi Osei, who runs Osei Group. Not the woman who has been restructuring failing companies for 15 years. My wife who works in operations. Like a hobby she had. Like something quaint." The venture capitalist glanced at Naomi with polite curiosity. "What kind of companies do you work with?" Naomi kept her voice level and her posture easy. Mid-sized organizations primarily. Companies going through ownership transitions or struggling with execution failures. I specialize in what my industry calls operational rescue, stepping into acquisitions or restructures that are in distress and stabilizing the underlying infrastructure. Rescue, the woman said, and something shifted in her attention. That sounds significant. It can be. Naomi set her glass down on a passing tray. Most acquisitions fail, not because the strategy was wrong, but because the buyer focused entirely on vision and forgot that operations are what make vision viable. You can design the most elegant deal structure in the world. If you cannot execute it, if you do not respect the complexity of making things actually function at scale, everything collapses from the inside. She said it calmly, conversationally, without looking at Adrian. But the venture capitalist was looking at her now with something that had moved past polite into genuine. Adrian was already steering the conversation elsewhere. Naomi excused herself quietly and went to find the bar, ordered sparkling water, stood at the edge of the ballroom, and watched her husband work the room the way she had watched him for years, with the particular combination of admiration and resignation that had defined so much of her interior life in this marriage. He was good at this, always had been, the commanding presence, the easy charm, the quality of confidence that made people lean in. She had loved that about him, had loved standing beside him and feeling like she was part of the light he generated. At some point, she had stopped being part of the light, had become a fixture in the background of it, had told herself that was fine, was just the nature of their dynamic, was just how things worked when two ambitious people built a life together and one of them moved faster toward the spotlight. She had stopped telling herself that approximately 3 weeks ago in a corridor with her coat still on. Naomi. She turned. A man in his early 60s stood beside her. Sharp eyes, the unhurried quality of someone who had nothing left to prove. She recognized him immediately. Elliot Winters, the CEO of a major regional conglomerate she had worked with on a restructure 2 years prior. She had spent 11 months saving his company from an acquisition integration that was collapsing in real time. He had tried to hire her permanently when it was over. She had turned him down, too complicated with Adrian's schedule. "Mr. Winters," she said, and the smile was genuine. "I did not realize you would be here." He smiled back, could not miss it. Too many important people in one room. He gestured toward the crowd with mild amusement. "I was standing over there watching you have a conversation that person clearly did not fully appreciate." Naomi almost laughed. "I also wanted to ask," he continued, "whether you are still entirely opposed to leaving your current firm." He was direct about it, no social preamble, the way he operated in every context she had ever seen him in. "We are expanding the executive team. I need someone who understands operational resilience at a strategic level. Someone who can walk into systems in distress and see the underlying architecture before anyone else has named the problem. You are the best I have encountered at that specific skill." That is generous. It is accurate. He said it without softening it. "I am not in the habit of flattering people I am trying to negotiate with. The position is Executive Vice President of Strategic Operations. Your own team, real authority, meaningful resource allocation, and before you tell me your husband's schedule makes it complicated." He paused. "The role is based here. Minimal travel." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "My husband's schedule is less of a constraint than it used to be," she said. "Can I have a few days to think about it?" "Of course." Winters reached into his jacket and produced a card, wrote something on the back, handed it to her. "That is my direct line. Call when you are ready. Or when you are finished waiting for the room to see what you are actually worth." He walked away before she could respond. She stood holding the card and looked out at the ballroom, at Adrian at the center of a circle of admiration, at the room that had been looking past her all evening, at the life she had built inside someone else's narrative and called it partnership. She slipped the card into her clutch, returned to Adrian's side, played the role for the rest of the evening, smiled in the right places, said the appropriate things, existed in the background of his performance with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. And while she smiled and nodded and moved through the ballroom as his pleasant, understated accessory, something settled into place inside her. She was not just going to walk away from Adrian when this ended. She was going to walk toward something. toward the professional recognition she had been deferring, toward the visibility she had been trained to avoid, toward a version of herself that did not reshape around someone else's ambition and call it love. Adrian had taught her to be invisible. And invisibility, she had finally understood, was not a diminishment. It was a position, one she had been occupying strategically for years without ever consciously choosing it. She was choosing it now, for 6 more weeks, precisely as long as he needed her to be patient. And then she was going to stop being patient entirely. The 4th week brought the interview. It was a major industry publication, the kind that covered high-level acquisitions and corporate strategy, with the seriousness of a financial journal and the reach of a mainstream magazine. They had been following the Vantage deal as a feature story. Ambitious acquisition, interesting structure, photogenic CEO with a compelling personal narrative. They asked Adrian about operational challenges. He answered the way he answered everything. Operations are not complex, he said. You bring competent people in to handle the execution. The real skill is in vision, in seeing the opportunity. Anyone can execute once the path is clear. Naomi read the interview on her phone at her office desk on a Thursday afternoon. She read it twice. The second time she read it, she set her phone face down on her desk and sat very still and looked at the wall and allowed herself to feel, fully and without the armor of strategy, the complete weight of what she had spent 9 years accommodating. He had said it publicly, had reduced the entire discipline she had mastered, the complex, skilled, deeply strategic work of making organizations actually function, to something simple, obvious. Beneath the notice of people doing real work, she had explained operational complexity to him across 100 different contexts, had shown him, through her own work, what execution actually required, had watched him use her frameworks in presentations and call them instincts, and he had said it publicly. Her phone started moving within an hour, messages from colleagues, professional contacts, people who knew her work. Did you see this? Can you believe this attitude? This is exactly why acquisitions fail. One message came from the CEO of Carrick Systems. Just read the interview. Is this the kind of operational respect we can expect post-acquisition? We need to talk. Naomi responded to her colleague's message with a single precise sentence. I think you should trust your professional instincts about what kind of partnership will serve Carrick's long-term interests. The response came within minutes. We are withdrawing. Sending formal notice today? This is not the kind of buyer we want to depend on. Naomi thanked her for the update, closed her messages, sat quietly in her office feeling something she had not allowed herself to feel in weeks. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than either. The specific feeling of natural consequences arriving at exactly the moment they were earned. She picked up her phone and called Elliot Winters. I have thought about your offer, she said when he answered. And, if it is still available, I would like to accept. Winters' voice carried a warmth she had not expected from someone she primarily knew in professional contexts. It is absolutely still available. When can you start? I will need to give 3 weeks' notice at my current firm. She looked at her calendar. She wanted to be precise about the overlap. I want to ensure my existing clients are properly transitioned. 3 weeks is perfect, he paused. Welcome to the team, Naomi. You are going to do extraordinary things here. After she ended the call, she sat quietly in her office for a long moment. Her marriage was ending. Adrian's deal was fracturing, and she was walking away from both of them, not diminished, but elevated, moving toward something instead of waiting inside, something that had already ended without her permission. She should have felt guilty, should have felt something other than this clean, clarifying certainty that every action she had taken since the hallway was simply honest, simply the natural result of removing her protection from a man who had never valued it enough to even recognize it was there. But guilt required believing she had done something wrong, and all she had done was stop. She gathered her things and headed home. Tonight she was going to have a conversation with her husband that she had been preparing for, in one form or another, for 9 years. Not because she wanted to hurt him, because it was simply, finally, time. Adrian was already home when she arrived. His car was in the building's private bay. She could hear him on a call as she came through the door, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone managing a situation that was becoming unmanageable. She went to the kitchen and made herself tea. 20 minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, looking like he had aged several years in the space of one afternoon. "Carrick pulled out," he said, without preamble. "Just completely withdrew. Sent a formal notice this afternoon." "That is serious," Naomi said. "It comes out of nowhere." He ran a hand through his hair. "I have investors calling. My team is scrambling. I need to get Carrick back to the table, and I do not understand what changed." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had not looked at her in months. "You know people in operational circles," he said. "You have contacts. Could you reach out? See if anyone has a relationship with Carrick's leadership. I need someone who can open a door." Naomi set down her tea. She had imagined this moment many times in the past 5 weeks, had rehearsed various versions of it in her mind the way she rehearsed client presentations, running through the possible responses, the emotional variables, the different ways a conversation could move depending on where she chose to begin. She had always known he would eventually ask her to save him. She had also always known exactly what she was going to say. "I have more than contacts at Carrick," she said, and her voice was completely steady. "I have been consulting for them for the past 3 weeks. They hired me to advise on vendor relationship management during corporate acquisitions." Adrian's expression moved through several things very quickly and did not settle on any of them. "I gave them my honest professional assessment," Naomi continued, "about their leverage position, about the operational risks they were assuming, about what typically happens to licensing partners when the acquiring firm lacks execution competence." His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "You told them to pull out of my deal. I told them to trust their professional instincts and protect their interests. They made their own decisions." "That is the same thing, Naomi." "It is not." She met his eyes. "The same way honest counsel and convenient outcome are not the same thing even when they produce identical results." He stared at her, and in the staring she could see the exact moment when the version of her he had been carrying in his mind, patient, focused on work, too composed to complicate his life, began to be replaced by something else, something he did not yet have a name for. "We are married," he said. "We are." She stood up, moved to the kitchen counter, and placed her hand on the folder she had put there that morning. "And because we are married, I have been a named party on your business accounts for 9 years. I have full viewing access and transaction rights to a significant portion of your professional financial infrastructure. You never removed me because you never thought I would look." He said nothing. "You also never changed the passwords on your professional email," she said. "The account you set up on our shared desktop when you were running the firm from our spare room, the password manager still has your credentials. I've been reading your correspondence with Irina for 5 weeks. The silence that followed was not like the silence in the hallway. That silence had been private. This one was between them, and it had weight. "Claire," he said, and then caught himself. "Naomi." She placed the folder on the counter in front of him. "Divorce papers. My attorney files on Monday. Inside, you will also find a detailed accounting of the asset transfers you have made over the past 7 weeks. The restructuring you described to Irina as the financial component of your clean exit strategy. The accounts reorganized to minimize my claim, the entities you moved out of joint ownership without disclosure." Adrian's hands went flat on the counter. "Here is what I am offering," Naomi said. "You agree to a full and honest settlement, complete asset disclosure, fair division, including the business relationships and financial foundations that carry my name from the early years of your firm. No contest. In exchange, this stays private. The affair, the financial maneuvering, the Vantage failure, none of it becomes part of a public record. And, if you contest, then my attorney files everything publicly, including a professional analysis of the Vantage acquisition failure, an operational case study examining what happens when an acquiring firm dismisses execution complexity as simple." She paused. "I will not need to name you directly. Everyone in the industry will know exactly whose failure I am analyzing." Adrian looked at the folder, then at her, then at the folder again. "How long have you been preparing this?" he said. "Since the evening I came home from Singapore and stood in the hallway and heard you describe me to your girlfriend as something to be transitioned away from." She picked up her bag. You said I was too focused on work to notice. You said I would process it cleanly. You said I was comfortable rather than essential. He had said all of it, had mapped his assumptions about her with complete confidence. From the other side of a door he never thought she was standing behind. She had let him, had listened to every word, had filed every assumption with the precision she applied to everything that mattered. You were right that I am good at processing things cleanly, she said. You were wrong about everything else. She walked to the door and stopped. I have also accepted the EVP position at Winter Strategic, she said. I start in 3 weeks. Several of your current clients are in operational distress that my new team will be uniquely positioned to address. They will find their way to us. That is just market dynamics. She looked at him one last time. You told Irina you were planning a clean exit, she said. I wanted you to know that I got there first. She left him standing in the kitchen of the building she owned, took her coat, took her bag, and walked out into the city evening. Drove to the hotel she had reserved the previous day, went up to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 5 weeks she let herself feel everything she had been holding at a careful operational distance. She cried, not with dramatics, not with the performance of grief, just honestly, quietly, for the woman she had been when she loved him without conditions, for the marriage she had genuinely wanted to build, for the years she had made herself smaller and called it partnership, and believed that patience and loyalty would be recognized eventually by a man who was fundamentally incapable of recognizing anything he had stopped needing to work for. She cried for about 20 minutes. Then she ordered room service, ate food she actually wanted, sat in the window looking at the city lights, and thought about the Meridian partnership and the Winter's position and the life that was waiting on the other side of the next 3 weeks. She had been patient for 9 years. She was finished being patient now. And the world, she was beginning to understand, was going to look completely different on the other side of that choice. If you are watching this and you have ever been the person doing the invisible work, the one whose contributions were described as just execution, just detail, just the background, I want you to pause here, right here, because what Naomi did was not revenge. It was not cruelty. It was the act of a woman who finally stopped protecting someone from the consequences of not seeing her. That is not destruction. That is just what happens when the foundation decides to stop holding up a structure that was never designed to honor it. Subscribe to Untold Desires. Stay right here, because her story is not over yet. It is only just beginning. She filed on Monday morning. The sun was barely over the skyline when Naomi arrived at her attorney's office. No drama, no entourage. Just a woman in a charcoal coat with a leather folder under her arm, and the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and finished grieving it in the same weekend. Her attorney, a woman named Priscilla, who had been practicing family and corporate law for 22 years and had seen most of what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the name of love and money, looked across the desk at Naomi and said, "Are you certain?" Naomi looked back at her evenly. "File everything." Priscilla nodded and reached for her pen. Outside, the city was beginning its morning. Buses, coffee shops opening their shutters, people moving toward their days with the ordinary purpose that ordinary days required. Naomi sat in a leather chair across from her attorney and signed her name in all the places that required it, and did not hesitate once. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not raise its voice. It does not tremble or make speeches. It just shows up at the right hour with the right documents and does what needs to be done with complete and quiet precision. That was the courage Naomi carried into that office on Monday morning. And it was more than enough. Adrian called 11 times before noon. She did not answer. He sent 4 messages, each one with a different emotional register. The first was controlled and asking her to call when she had a moment. The second was frustrated and asking what she was trying to accomplish. The third was quieter and asking if they could just talk. The fourth was a single line that said, "Please." She read all 4, responded to none. There was nothing left to negotiate. She had given him the terms on Sunday evening in their kitchen. Either he accepted them and they moved through this with dignity, or he contested them and she let the full documentation become public record. The choice was his. The conversation was over. By Tuesday afternoon, the divorce filing was on public record. By Wednesday morning, her phone was full of messages. Friends expressing shock, colleagues offering sympathy, professional contacts who had not realized the marriage was in difficulty sending careful, warm notes that tried to be supportive without being intrusive. She responded to each one with genuine appreciation and the minimum detail required. She was not interested in performing her grief publicly, had never been interested in that. One message stood out from the rest. It came from the CEO of Carrick Systems, and it said simply, "I just saw the news. I had absolutely no idea you were dealing with any of this while you were helping us. I am so sorry. Are you all right?" Naomi sat with that message for a moment before responding. Honestly, she wrote back, "I am better than all right. Thank you for asking." She meant it completely and without performance. She was better than all right. For the first time in years, she was moving in a direction she had chosen entirely for herself, and the feeling of that, the specific, unfamiliar feeling of occupying her own life with her full presence, was something she did not yet have an adequate word for. Not happiness exactly, something more structural than happiness, more like the sensation of a building finally standing on its actual foundations. The professional fallout for Adrian moved quickly. Word of the divorce spread through the industry network the way these things always do, faster than people intend, with more detail than anyone meant to share. And as the news spread, people began asking questions. The kind of questions that accumulate when a high-profile deal is collapsing simultaneously with a high-profile marriage. Why were the Vantage vendors withdrawing? What had changed in the acquisition structure? Why were two of Adrian's major institutional investors requesting emergency review meetings? The answers assembled themselves from publicly available information, from professional gossip, from the specific texture of a deal that was failing in ways that pointed clearly toward operational incompetence at the acquiring level. The Vantage acquisition collapsed formally the following Thursday. Adrian's lead investor withdrew funding on the Wednesday. The remaining licensing conversations that had still technically been in progress ended within 48 hours of each other. The acquisition that was supposed to establish his firm as a serious player in infrastructure logistics became instead a case study in how not to approach operational integration. The article about his vision and ambition was followed, 3 weeks later, by a very different kind of article. One that examined the structural failures of the deal in careful, impersonal, devastating detail. The phrase "anyone can execute" was quoted in 2 separate pieces. Naomi read both of them at her new desk at Winter Strategic on the morning they published. Read them once, noted what they contained, and returned to the work she was building. She did not feel satisfaction. Did not feel the dark pleasure that people sometimes expected her to feel when they asked about it later. She felt, mostly, the absence of something she had been carrying for a very long time, the weight of maintaining the pretense that Adrian's dismissiveness was temporary, that the distance was circumstantial, that if she was patient enough, consistent enough, good enough at making herself small enough not to inconvenience his ambitions, he would eventually see her. That weight was gone, and the space where it had been was filling up with something else entirely. Winter Strategic was everything Elliot Winters had described and more. Her team was 12 people, hand-selected, each one bringing a specific competence that complemented her own. They were smart, direct, and completely uninterested in politics. They wanted to solve problems, and they had chosen to do it under her leadership because they had read her case studies and believed she was the best person to learn from. That belief, uncomplicated, professionally grounded, freely given, was something she had not realized she was starved for until she was suddenly surrounded by it every day. She led her first major operational rescue in the second week. A mid-sized logistics company, 3 months from collapse, struggling with an acquisition integration that had been mishandled from the beginning. She walked in, assessed the underlying structure in 72 hours, identified the 3 critical failures no one had named clearly enough to address, and presented a turnaround framework on day 5 that her client's board approved unanimously. Her team watched her do it and took notes. She went home that evening to her apartment, 3 floors she had purchased with the settlement funds and renovated entirely to her own taste, and cooked herself dinner and ate it at a table that looked out over the city and felt something she could only describe as alignment. The sense of occupying your life at full volume. She had always been exceptional at her work. had always known this about herself with the quiet certainty of someone who had enough evidence not to need external confirmation. But there is a difference between knowing your value in the abstract and being allowed to exercise it completely. There is a difference between competence that is used and competence that is recognized. For 9 years, she had been the former. She was now, finally, fully the latter. The apartment itself was an act of declaration she had not consciously planned, but could not have avoided. Every choice she made in furnishing it was a choice she had been deferring for years. Art she actually responded to, not art selected to impress someone else's clients. Books stacked horizontally because she liked how they looked that way, not arranged for an aesthetic someone else would photograph. A kitchen fitted with the kind of serious equipment that signaled genuine intention rather than casual interest. A reading room with a chair she had spent 3 hours in a furniture store finding. The exact right chair, the one that held her body correctly and looked out a window with the right angle of afternoon light. Small things, personal things, the kind of things that accumulate into a life instead of just maintaining one. She reconnected with friends she had slowly lost contact with during the marriage. Women and men she had liked genuinely and drifted from because her energy had been so entirely organized around Adrian and his world that there had been nothing left over for connections that were purely hers. She called them, had dinners, rebuilt the easy familiarity that real friendship holds even through long silences. She started painting again, had loved it in university, had set it aside because Adrian thought it was impractical, and she had absorbed that judgment the way she had absorbed so many of his, without fully noticing. She was not particularly skilled, did not need to be. She bought canvases and paints, and spent Sunday mornings making things that no one would ever display in a gallery, and found the process nourishing in a way she had forgotten creative things could be. She did not think about Adrian very much. That surprised her initially. She had expected grief to be more persistent, more demanding, had braced herself for the long aftermath of a 9-year marriage in the way you brace for a recovery you know will be slow. But what she found instead was that most of what she had been grieving, she had already been grieving for years, quietly, inside the marriage itself. The gradual erosion of being seen, the accumulated small losses of being categorized rather than known. The active, sharp part of the grief had happened in a hotel room on a Sunday evening. And when she had finished it, she had ordered room service and gone to sleep and woken up the next morning already on the other side of it. What remained was not grief. It was curiosity, the wide, unhurried curiosity of someone looking at an open horizon after a very long time looking at a wall. She was interested in what came next. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Naomi received a call from Renata Solis at Meridian Capital. They had been in conversation since the gala, carefully, professionally, with the measured pace of two people who recognized that the thing they were building together required the right foundation. Renata had been watching OSE Group's positioning in infrastructure logistics for over a year, had identified Naomi not as a convenient partner but as the specific, irreplaceable piece that an infrastructure play of this scale required. She is not just operationally brilliant, Renata told her board when she presented the partnership proposal. She understands this sector from the inside. She has the vendor relationships. She has the institutional trust. She has the track record. Without her, this acquisition is a vision. With her, it is a company. The partnership closed on a Thursday morning. It was the largest acquisition OSE Group had ever undertaken. The infrastructure logistics play that Naomi had been researching and positioning for quietly over 2 years, the sector that Adrian had been trying to enter for the same period, the space he had pursued through the Vantage deal, with confidence and without operational foundation. She entered it with a fully developed execution strategy, 3 confirmed vendor partnerships, institutional financing secured on the strength of her professional reputation, and a CEO who had spent a year specifically waiting for her to be available. The announcement ran in the same industry publication that had quoted Adrian saying anyone can execute. Naomi did not notice the timing until a colleague pointed it out. Then she laughed, genuinely, fully, without performance. She was being interviewed for a profile piece the following month when the journalist asked about the Meridian partnership and what it represented for OSE Group's trajectory. Naomi answered the operational questions precisely and without embellishment. Then the journalist paused and asked something more personal. There has been a lot written about your year, she said. The divorce, the professional transition, the Meridian deal. How do you think about that period now? Naomi was quiet for a moment. I think about it as the year I stopped accommodating and started deciding, she said. Those are not the same thing, even when they look similar from the outside. Accommodation is organized around what someone else needs from you. Decision is organized around what you are actually building. For a long time I confused them. I do not confuse them anymore. The journalist wrote it down carefully. Is there anything you regret? She asked. Naomi considered the question with the genuine attention she tried to give everything worth answering honestly. I regret that I was patient in ways that cost me years I could have spent more fully, she said. I do not regret the patience itself. It taught me everything I needed to know about systems, dependencies, the places where organizations and relationships alike fail when they dismiss the value of what holds them together. That knowledge is the foundation of everything I have built, so I cannot regret acquiring it, even in the way I did. She paused. What I would tell someone younger, she said, is this. Patience is one of the most powerful tools you will ever have. But it has to be yours. You have to be choosing it consciously, for reasons that serve your own architecture, not simply defaulting to it because someone else is comfortable with your silence. There is a difference between strategic patience and passive disappearance. I spent too long in the second kind before I found my way to the first. The journalist published the profile on a Sunday. By Monday morning, Naomi's phone had not stopped. Messages from women who recognized themselves in the story, from executives who had been dismissed in boardrooms and boardrooms had called it just being thorough, from people who had spent years doing invisible work and were exhausted by the invisibility and did not know yet that the exhaustion was information, was direction, was their own internal architecture telling them something important about where they needed to move next. She read every message, could not respond to all of them, but she read them. 3 months after the profile ran, Naomi received an invitation to speak at the industry's major annual conference. The topic was operational resilience during corporate transitions. Her name was listed first on the program, not as a spouse, not as a supporting presenter, as the keynote. She had accepted on the same day the invitation arrived. She spent 3 weeks preparing, not because the material was difficult. She could have delivered this talk in her sleep, but because she wanted it to be right, wanted every word to carry the specific weight of hard-won knowledge rather than the lighter weight of theoretical expertise. She wanted the people in that room to leave with something they could use. She stood at the podium on a Tuesday morning and looked out at a room that was full. Not politely full, actually full, standing room at the back. People who had rearranged their conference schedules to be there. People who had driven in the night before from other cities specifically for this session. She was the reason the room was full. Her expertise, her work, her name. She took a breath and began. The invisible infrastructure of success, she said, is the thing we talk about least and depend on most. Every organization that has ever succeeded has done so because someone was doing the work of making the vision viable. The detailed, complex, deeply skilled work of execution, of making things actually function at scale, of managing the relationships and dependencies and operational architectures that determine whether strategy becomes reality or remains a very expensive idea. She let that settle. We have a cultural habit, she continued, of celebrating vision and dismissing execution, of calling strategy the real work and operations the detail, of assuming that anyone can execute once the path is clear, as if the path clearing itself, the sustained, sophisticated, irreplaceable work of implementation, is somehow automatic. She did not look at anyone in particular, did not need to. She was speaking to everyone. It is not automatic. It is never automatic. And the organizations that fail, the acquisitions that collapse, the companies that implode in the first year of transition, the mergers that become cautionary tales rather than success stories, they fail almost universally in the same place. Not in the vision, in the execution, in the dismissal of operational complexity as something simple, as something anyone can do, as something that does not require respect, resourcing, and genuine strategic investment. She used the Vantage acquisition as a case study, did not name the company, did not name Adrian, did not need to. Everyone in the room knew exactly whose failure she was analyzing. She presented it academically, clinically, With the detached expertise of someone who had learned this lesson from a position so close to the subject that it had cost her something real. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the applause began. It was the kind of applause that builds from the back before the front joins in. The kind that starts because people feel something and need to express it before they have consciously decided to. She stood at the podium and received it without false modesty and without performance, just with the steady, grounded acknowledgement of someone who knew what the recognition was for and had earned every part of it. Afterward, people came to speak with her for 2 hours. Potential clients, potential collaborators, journalists who wanted to follow up. A young woman, maybe 26, who waited until almost everyone had gone, and then approached with the particular hesitance of someone who had something real to say and was not sure it would be welcome. "I wanted to tell you," the woman said, "that I have been in a situation at work for 3 years where my contributions are being taken and credited to someone else, where I have been told my work is detail, and his is strategy even though they cannot execute the strategy without my detail." She paused. "Your talk today was the first time someone in a room like this named that experience out loud." Naomi looked at her. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. The young woman blinked. "I am not sure yet." "Start by documenting what you actually do," Naomi said, "not for anyone else, for yourself, so that you have complete clarity about what you bring and what would stop functioning if you removed your presence. Once you know that with precision, you will know exactly what your leverage is. And then you will be able to make an actual decision about whether to stay and negotiate from strength or leave and build something of your own." She handed the woman a card. "Call my office," she said. "We are always looking for people who understand execution from the inside." The young woman looked at the card, and then at Naomi, and then back at the card, with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected door. Naomi knew that expression well, had worn it herself at a charity gala some months ago, standing at the edge of a ballroom with sparkling water in hand and a business card in her clutch, and the first real sense in years that the horizon was not as closed as she had come to believe. Doors looked like that when they first appeared. Surprising, a little overwhelming, almost too good to be true. They were real, though. The ones that mattered were always real. She walked out of the conference hall into the bright afternoon and went home. And on an evening 6 months after the deal closed, 4 months after the conference, almost a year to the day since she had come home from Singapore and stopped in a corridor with her coat on and heard herself being erased from a future she had helped build, Naomi Osei sat in her reading room in the chair she had spent 3 hours finding, with the right afternoon light at the right angle, and a book she was actually interested in reading, and a glass of wine she had chosen herself, and a life that was entirely, completely, undeniably hers. She did not think about Adrian, had not thought about him in a way that held weight in quite some time. He existed somewhere in the city, managing the diminished version of a firm that was slowly rebuilding under more modest expectations, navigating a professional reputation that carried the specific damage of a very public failure. She had heard through mutual contacts that Irina had left, had not been surprised. Irina had been attracted to success and proximity to power. Neither of those things had survived the Vantage collapse. Naomi did not feel satisfaction about any of it, did not feel the particular pleasure of watching someone receive consequences. She felt, mostly, nothing, which was its own form of completion. The neutrality of someone who had genuinely moved on, who had processed the experience fully enough that it had become information rather than wound. She opened her book. The afternoon light moved across the room in the way afternoon light moves when you have given it space to be itself. She read for an hour without interruption. The city hummed outside her window. Her team was working on 3 active client engagements, and all of them were progressing well. The Meridian integration was 6 months in and performing above the projections she had presented to the board. She was thinking about the young woman from the conference, had already asked her office to follow up, had a feeling about her, the specific instinct that came from recognizing, in someone else, the combination of real talent and systematic underestimation that she knew from the inside. Those were the people she wanted to build with, the ones who had been told their work was just detail, the ones who had been making the invisible visible for years and been thanked for it with silence. She was going to give them rooms to work in where the lights were on. She closed her book when the light shifted and sat for a moment in the pleasant, unhurried quiet of a life that asked nothing of her except that she inhabit it fully. She had built this, Every part of it. The company, the reputation, the team, the apartment, the reading room, the chair, the afternoon light. She had built it through 15 years of work that was too often described as just execution, just detail, just the background. She had built it while making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's vision. She had built it through the long, quiet patience of a woman who was preparing without knowing yet exactly what she was preparing for. She knew now. She had been preparing for this, for the moment when patience became power, when invisibility became strategy, when the person everyone had looked past finally stopped waiting for recognition and built something so undeniable that recognition was no longer relevant. She had not needed Adrian to see her. She had needed to stop letting his not seeing determine what she believed herself capable of. There is something I want you to carry from Naomi's story as we reach the end of it. Not the drama of the confrontation, though that had its own particular satisfaction. Not the professional collapse of the man who dismissed execution as simple, though there is something clarifying about watching natural consequences arrive on schedule. What I want you to carry is something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Patience, when it is chosen consciously and wielded with precision, is one of the most sophisticated forms of power available to a human being. But there is a version of patience that is not power, a version that is accommodation wearing power's clothing. That looks, from the outside, like strategic stillness, but is actually the slow, steady compression of a person making themselves smaller and smaller to avoid occupying space that might inconvenience someone else. Naomi was in both kinds across the span of her marriage. She was genuinely patient, and she was also genuinely disappearing. The hallway moment did not just reveal what Adrian was doing to her. It revealed what she had been allowing, what she had been complicit in, not from weakness, but from a kind of love that had not yet learned its own boundaries. That is the harder truth of her story, the one underneath the satisfying parts. The moment she changed was not the moment she turned the tables on Adrian. The moment she changed was the moment she decided she was worth fighting for, with the same precision and commitment she had always brought to fighting for everyone else. If you have been invisible in your own life, if you have been the person holding the structure together while someone else took credit for the architecture, I want you to hear this clearly. Your patience is not nothing. Every hour you have spent doing the invisible work, every time you kept the system running when it should have broken, every relationship you maintained, and every crisis you absorbed quietly so that someone else's vision could survive long enough to become something real, that is not weakness. That is expertise. That is the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of someone who understands from the inside how things actually function. And expertise, when you finally turn it toward your own life, is extraordinary. The question is not whether you have power. You have always had power. The question is whether you have been directing it toward yourself or loaning it indefinitely to someone who never looked closely enough to value it. There is a version of this story where Naomi stays, where she absorbs the hallway conversation the way she absorbed everything else, and files it away, and adds it to the weight she was already carrying, and goes on being patient for another year, and another, until the patience became indistinguishable from surrender. She did not choose that version. You do not have to either. The moment you stop protecting someone from the consequences of not seeing you, that moment does not require drama. It does not require a confrontation or a folder of documents or a public case study at an industry conference. Sometimes it is as quiet as a decision made in a hotel room on a Sunday evening. As simple as opening your laptop on a Monday morning and sending the email that starts the next chapter. The exit from invisibility does not always look like Naomi's. It does not always arrive with professional leverage and a settled divorce and a keynote invitation. Sometimes it is slower and quieter and less cinematic. Sometimes it is just a single conversation where you say what you actually think instead of what keeps the peace. Sometimes it is a choice to stop deferring, to stop adjusting, to stop shrinking. But it begins the same way for everyone. It begins the moment you decide that your presence in your own life is not optional. To everyone who is rebuilding after a long period of invisibility, I see you. The work you did, The invisible labor that kept things functioning, the patience you brought to situations that did not deserve it, none of that was wasted. It was preparation. It was knowledge you now carry in your body and your instincts and your understanding of how things actually work underneath the surface. That knowledge is yours. No one can take it. No one can dismiss it into irrelevance. No one can say it was just execution and make it less than what it is. It is the foundation of everything you are going to build. And I pray that you find the courage to start building. I pray for the clarity to recognize the difference between patience that is building something and patience that is simply allowing your own erasure. I pray for the strength to move when the moment comes, to act with precision rather than drama, to protect yourself with the same quality of commitment you have always brought to protecting everyone else. I pray that you walk into the next chapter of your life with your full presence, not accommodated, not adjusted, not edited down to a size that makes someone else comfortable. Whole, visible, entirely, powerfully, undeniably yourself. Naomi Osai stood in a corridor with her coat on and heard herself being erased, and she chose not to disappear. That choice built a company, restored a reputation, reclaimed 9 years of invisible labor, and created a life that no one would ever again describe as just the background. But more than any of that, more than the Meridian deal or the keynote or the apartment with the right afternoon light, it gave her back the thing she had been slowly, quietly surrendering for years. Herself. That is what is waiting on the other side of your patience. Not revenge, not the collapse of the person who underestimated you. Just yourself. Fully inhabited, completely present, finally, beautifully, uncompromisingly yours. Take the first step toward it. You have been preparing longer than you know. Welcome to the family. We will see you in the next story.